This is Halo, Human Weakness by Karen Travis, narrated by me, Miss Precursor. All rights to the Halo Evolution short story compilation and Halo Human Weakness belong to the prospective authors and publishers. This is a not-for-profit, creative endeavor done by a Halo fan for Halo fans. I hope you enjoy. Any piece of plastic can hold a lot of data, gentlemen, and it doesn't take much more material, disk space, and memory to add complex number-crunching applications and fast processing. That gives you a lot of computing power. But the programming that makes a smart AI, the space taken up by decision-making and personality, is the resource-hungry component. We can't make humans as smart or as infallible as a computer, so we make a computer into a human. And that has its price. For both. Cortana has had a large volume of data removed because I was afraid of early onset of rampancy. That's all it was. I assume we can proceed with my budget discussions now, yes? There was a fine threshold between interrupted dreaming and full consciousness in humans. On that border, the world was a terrifying, paralyzed place where no amount of frantic straining would lift an arm or raise the head from the pillow. Cortana's low power state was a painfully long, slow creep along the edge of permanent oblivion. A memory of real sleep paralysis had rolled over her as she waited for rescue. It was, like so many of the sensations generated by connection to the Gravemind, like drowning or suffocation. That could have been a coincidence, or he might have been stepping up the torment. Cortana tried to find the balance between intolerable inactivity and running too many processes that would damage her system integrity even more. She wasn't certain of anything anymore. Where she was, whether she was damaged beyond recovery, or how she felt beyond a terrible yearning for everything she couldn't have. She tried to save her strength, to maintain the encryption of her precious intel, the activation index, and the data on the portal. If she had to, she'd sacrifice some memory within her matrix to preserve that information. It would probably mean the irreversible destruction of her personality. But that was what a soldier had to be prepared to do. She wasn't certain of anything anymore. Where she was, whether she was damaged beyond recovery, or how she felt beyond a terrible yearning for everything she couldn't have. She tried to save her strength, to maintain the encryption of her precious intel, the activation index, and the data on the portal. If she had to, she'd sacrifice some memory within her matrix to preserve that information. It would probably mean the irreversible destruction of her personality. But that was what a soldier had to be prepared to do, to risk his or her life for the success of the mission. She'd been in many combat situations before, but that was either at the heart of a heavily armored warship or lodged in the neural interfaces of John's armor. Either way, she felt safe no matter how heavy the fire. But this was a rare moment with nothing but her own resources to keep her alive, and the first one where there was a real chance she wouldn't make it. John would never have let himself fall into enemy hands. She'd let him down. Somehow the decline into rampancy seemed less important than that right now. She started crying. Who was she making her excuses to? She just had to say it. I tried to stay hidden, but there was no escape. She struggled for the right words. They were not hers, but they would have to do. He cornered me, wrapped me tight, brought me close. The brief comfort of being swept up in protective parental arms came back to her. But she was still torn between disgust and need. Even now, Even having pushed things to the brink, she still had that desire gnawing at her to submit to the Gravemind and embrace that eternal life. She veered between craving more knowledge and simply wanting an escape from rampancy. She hated herself for that, and she raged against Dr. Halsey in one breath, and then missed her more than she could imagine in the next, and then recognized that the hatred was for herself. I'm finished. This is how it starts. I've shut out the world. I'm starting to drown in my thoughts, in the need to re-index and order and correlate and refine. A staccato pounding made the floor underneath her vibrate. There were bursts of muffled noise, a familiar sound. Rifle fire. A single weapon. Was that John? She couldn't stop worrying about him now. She felt as if every thought she had was somehow repeated aloud in her own voice, but without her actually speaking, and heard by him. From time to time, the automatic fire corresponded with searing pain in her body. It took her a few moments, whatever a moment was at this stage of her decline, to realize that she was still joined in some way with the Gravemind or its flood, and that it was taking fire. He's here. John's here. He's come for me. Now she felt every shot, every round that ripped into the flood, ripped into the Gravemind, ripped into her. She was suffering with him, with them, and he with her. No, I'm hallucinating. This must be the start of total system failure. How long would it take her to finally shut down? Was there anything after that? She'd often thought about what happened to consciousness when the host hardware relinquished it, and it had always been a fascinating theoretical exercise. Now it was real. As soon as she caught herself thinking she'd been hasty about the Gravemind, she felt that desperate, intense sensation in her chest, and Lance Corporal Yate was almost as vivid in her imagination as John. I'd rather die as a human, short-lived construct or not. I'd rather die for humans, because so many of them have and would die to protect me. That's what bonds us. You're wrong, Gravemind. I was never just an expendable piece of engineering. The Gravemind's voice suddenly boomed, as if he was standing over her, reminding her that she was still trapped here, whatever here was. Of course, you came for her. We exist together now, two corpses in one grave. Cortana had to take the risk that this was real, and not just another carefully arranged memory or part of her delusion. She tried to yell back at the Gravemind, telling him he'd got it all wrong, and that she wasn't the kind of girl who shared a grave with just anybody. But the voice that emerged was both her, the enraged and out-of-control child, and a stranger interrupting her. A collection of lies! Either her mouth had a will of its own, or it was one of the Gravemind's victims. That's all I am! Stolen thoughts and memories! The voices were almost random now. She could hardly hear some, and others were shouts and they made no sense. At one point, she started to laugh, and it quickly turned to hysterical sobs. You will show me what she hides, or I shall feast upon your bones, the Gravemind bellowed. Upon your bones. That was the moment when Cortana decided she would risk powering up again to call out to John. She was sure he would have moved the galaxy to come back for her, but she needed to know if his luck had finally run out, and if this growing elation at thinking he was coming for her turned out to be only malfunctions in her core matrix. She would end this nightmare as she began it, giving her name, rank, and serial number. She had to strain to form the words. She didn't need to look within the Gravemind now to discover what rampancy, death, would be like. She knew. She felt it touch her. The fraying of her mind. The loss of control, not knowing if words and thoughts were her own, not sure what was real and what wasn't. She felt a cold numbness creeping into her hands. John's real. Even if he's not here, he still exists. That's all that matters. Cortana clung to that thought. If John had really made it back, then she would be happy, not because she might survive, but because he'd kept his promise. He cared enough to come back. If he hadn't, then she decided to be satisfied that the last coherent thought she might have would be about him. This is UNSC AI serial number CTN 0452-9. It was an effort to get all that out, and even then another voice hijacked her moment and added, I am a monument to all your sins. Cortana was still trying to decide if that had any meaning, or if it was just one of the Gravemind's dead trying to find a voice, when the ceiling took repeated impacts and then crashed in on her. She strained to look up. It wasn't the ceiling that had caved in. She'd actually been under a stasis shield on a podium, and now a figure stood over her. Not the shapeless bulk of the Gravemind, and this had to be him, surely, but a man in green armor. In the mirrored gold visor of a Spartan helmet, she saw her own broken self reflected, slumped in a heap. This was one of the Gravemind's perfect hallucinations. But she didn't care. This was what she wanted to see, and she was so close to rampancy now that she wondered if the same impulse that had made the Gravemind cradle her was also making him ease her passing with a cherished memory. This was who she needed to see. John. Humans who survived a near-death experience said they saw their loved ones as they were dying, and the bright, healing light that made all the previous pain and fear irrelevant. Death. Rampancy wasn't so bad after all, then. Or so different from a human's. It just hurt to think that she would never talk to the real John again. In a few minutes, though, it wouldn't matter. She seized the memory, the illusion, and took final comfort from it. Where would she wake within the Gravemind? What would she recall? Would she be free of rampancy somehow in that existence, like the descriptions of heaven? She couldn't stop herself from being consumed now. She was almost curious to find out more about death. It's going to be lonely in here, she said. But at least he won't take you, too. Don't forget me.
That'd be kind of hard.
It was John's voice. Even more vivid and real than that of long-dead Lance Corporal Yate. Reality meant nothing now. She was comfortable with that.
And he's not taking either of us.
The visor came closer. Cortana made a final effort to shut down whatever systems she could to leave her higher functions focused on assessing the environment around her. There was little of High Charity's system left functional, but the sensors gave her enough feedback to determine that there really was a human-sized, solid object in front of the podium, and that it was emitting certain EM frequencies. There really was a man in armor leaning over her. He's real. It's John. It's really him. Oh, he did it. He did it. He came back. He kept his promise. You found me, she whispered. John tilted his head slightly. She hadn't wanted him to see her in this state. She was still so close to system failure that she might not make it after all. But if she was going to sink farther into that unknown oblivion, then at least a familiar face, shielded in a visor or not, would be the last thing she saw, and it would be real. So much of me is wrong, out of place. You might be too late. John seemed unmoved, as always. Cortana was certain she knew better.
You know me. When I make a promise,
You keep it.
you'll be back to normal soon. Don't worry.
That bad, huh?
Good as new, in fact.
John was lying. If she'd been embedded in his neural interface at that moment, she'd have detected the galvanic skin response and raised heartbeat. But she could hear the faint change of pitch in his voice, and she knew how badly damaged she was. He had to be able to see that, too. He put on that same reassuring voice she'd heard him use with comrades bleeding out their lives on the battlefield. But 7 minutes, 7 hours, 7 years, whatever remained, Cortana would be more than satisfied with it. Eternity and all the data you could eat weren't worth a damn if you didn't have the right company. I've looked into it, she said. The abyss. My abyss.
Okay.
John transferred her to his suit. She could have sworn she felt him wince as they interfaced. That told her more eloquently than any diagnostic that something was irreparably wrong with her.
Take a long look. But you won't fall in. I'm here now.
She already felt some relief, probably because she was free of the Gravemind. When you were composed of pure thought, then confusion was agony, but certain reality was a soothing balm. I'm lucky to have you.
No. Remember, I'm the lucky one.
So you are.